talking about corporate forms and primarily new corporate forms. And Sue teaches a class at Berkeley, which we co-taught at one point. I teach a similar class at NYU, and we talk a lot about new corporate forms, but I thought we'd start with the basic question about why it matters, and does it matter when we're looking to achieve a certain social or environmental impact? Does corporate form matter? Who wants to take that one on?
You look to the nonprofit guy?
Let's start with you, Rick Alexander. What's one of the, maybe you can pick one of the new forms and say why it matters? Or,
Sure. Well, I will take the view that it matters, since that's really the theory of change behind B-Lab, is that it's important to measure performance on social environmental factors, but it's also important to bake in for future performance that a company's obligated to perform that way. The way the law has developed in the United States, there is no accountability for a standard for-profit corporation to anyone other than stockholders. Sometimes there's a debate about whether corporations may put the interests of stakeholders over stockholders in some situations. I don't think they can, but others differ. But it doesn't, whichever side of that debate you come out on, I don't think there's anyone in the debate who would say there is positive accountability to other stakeholders in standard corporate law. So to sort of bake in an obligation to be accountable going forward, it's important to have a corporate form that does that. And there's several out there. Delaware has something called the Public Benefit Corporation. Other states have benefit corporations, social purpose corporations. Those are all ways of getting to a structure where you're obligated to other stakeholders, and some of them, including the benefit corporation models and the public benefit corporation models, have, in addition to accountability, transparency requirements. So not only do you have to be accountable to all stakeholders, you have to be transparent about how you're meeting those obligations.
And I'll say, for those of you who've heard me speak, I care about corporate form more than anything other than my children. So I obviously believe it really matters. It is the foundation. I mean, there's sometimes, because I live in California and there is a large Berkeley, Birkenstock wearing left. I mean, there are a lot of people who are like, should we have a corporation? Why don't we just get rid of the corporation altogether? I'm of the mindset that corporations are here. They are the most powerful sort of engines of economic growth, and possibly the most powerful engines, period, in our society, in our economy. And so working within that construct, you think about how do we deal with some of the larger issues of the day. If you argue, like I do, that government is fairly inefficient, nonprofits are designed to be inefficient, and I think fairly flawed. Unfortunately, we were talking at NYU last night, and I said fatally flawed to apparently a bunch of people who all worked at nonprofits. It wasn't my best move. At any rate, can you look at corporate form, and can you look at for-profit corporate form and move from a world, Rick and I disagree slightly, I think with the business judgment rule, corporations, while they don't consider stakeholders, can certainly consider a lot of factors other than just purely, and we would agree on that, shareholder value. So when you look at Google and what Google's doing with Google.org, or you look at a lot of the things, you look at executive comp, all of that doesn't lead directly to the bottom line. There are a lot of things corporations can do in around environmental as they're currently constructed. There are a lot of other models that we've played with traditional forms and LLCs and corporations where you can bake goodness in. But it's a question of, with all of the forms and the models that we've been using for existing corporations, it's permissive. We're saying, yes, you can do it, but you're not required to. We can show you how to do it if it's part of your business model, but you may have pressure from investors, you may have pressure from other third parties not to, and there's no requirement. All the new forms we're going to talk about today are actually including an affirmative requirement that you have to consider certain social and environmental goals. And it is the fabric of our society. For me, I got involved in this movement because if Chevron would change its corporate form and have the boards and management would have affirmative fiduciary duty to shareholder agreed environmental goals, and they could be sued on it, as with these new corporate forms, the first of which actually filed to go public, it's a game changer in terms of how we as a society operate.
Well, what's interesting to me coming from the nonprofit side is that there's different accountability for nonprofits. That you have actually two levels. On the corporate form, you have the state level Attorney General accountability, that there's enforcement around what your purposes are, what you can and can't do on the nonprofit. And so there's a stakeholder out there that can enforce the public good vis-a-vis nonprofits. Then separate from that, nonprofits have tax exemption. And so then there are the benefits that flow not necessarily from the corporate form, but to the corporate form as a result of how you've decided to restrict yourself. And there's another enforcement agency out there from the IRS and Senate Finance Committee and others that look at it from a governmental standpoint, what charities and nonprofits can and can't do. So there's requirements from the outside also built into the form and the benefits that you accord to these types of organizations that try to accomplish some of that. And what's interesting to me watching the debate about new corporate forms and the kind of the birth of these new corporate forms is the moment in time that we're at which demands that these things happen. Like, what is it that around how we think about impact, how do we think about social responsibility, that's saying to our old corporate forms that were built and designed in a very different environment, that you're no longer good enough for what we want to do. And for me, that's a very interesting moment because, to your point about the efficiency of nonprofits and whether the nonprofit itself is a good corporate form and how we regulate nonprofits is the right way to do it. It's also a conversation that we should be having as to this structure and what it can and can't accomplish.
Well, maybe you.
Yeah, I was just going to add from my perspective, I got interested in these new corporate forms because I'd lived for a few years in this Meteor world where it's all about trying to have massive social impact and using all the tools that we have, the not-for-profit grants, for-profit investments, just finding great entrepreneurs and helping them scale and do great things. And because we sort of play on both sides, sometime I would sort of appear as a foundation, and other times I would appear as sort of a commercial investor. And, be looking at deals that basically, I could sort of see from both sides. And what I kept seeing over and over again is that for traditional commercial investors and for traditional foundations, if the other side was looking at the deal, was interested in the entrepreneur, then they felt like they shouldn't be there. So it's sort of like, oh my God, a foundation is considering this, it must not be a good deal, it must not be for profit. Or a foundation says, wow, there's somebody from Sand Hill Road, Silicon Valley investors looking at this, definitely we shouldn't spend our foundation dollars on this. And, I could see it from both sides. So for me, the idea of these corporate forums was, could you create sort of a safe space that these kinds of capital could play together and really leverage and have much, much greater impact. From the foundation perspective, they know that there's a mission lock, that it's absolutely going to fit with their charitable purpose. And from the commercial investors' perspective, if they're comfortable with the business model, including that social purpose that's built into the Articles of Incorporation, but they still believe in the business model, they know that they can push as hard as they normally do for profit maximization because, they believe in the business model. And I think it's early days, but that's what got me interested.
And I just want to add something, sort of to riff on what everybody else is saying, the oversight function and the transparency that we're all talking about. So you have a nonprofit model that has the Attorney General and the IRS that makes sure that they are mission aligned. All of these forms, the new forms, there is no government oversight. There is no state or federal. It is shareholders. So we've drafted them so it's built, the mechanism built in is a shareholder can sue to enforce the same way a shareholder can sue to enforce if there's, waste and all that other bad stuff that the securities litigators handle. And yes, there is a very interesting question about damages.
Can a shareholder sue? So if I invest in a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation and I don't feel that they're sticking with the mission or meeting the goals, can I file a lawsuit?
So I'll tell you the answer in Delaware. The answer in Delaware is you can bring a suit to sort of enforce the stakeholder provisions if you're a stockholder, not if you're just a stakeholder, but if you're a stockholder, and if you have at least collectively 2% of the company, or for a public company, $2 million worth of stock, whichever is less. So the idea there is that you have to have some skin in the game. But then the statute has, we want the accountability, but we also want it to be workable. So the statute has written into it strong business judgment rule protection that basically says you're going to have to show that the balancing that the board did was just off the wall. So as long as they do the balancing, and as long as their conclusion isn't crazy, which is just sort of a way of expressing the business judgment rule, you're not going to be able to, attack that decision as long as it's not conflicted. And even maybe more importantly, even if you could show it's crazy, you can only get injunctive relief, and that was very important to us when we were drafting the statute, because we didn't want directors to be in the position where they said, well, gee, if I make this environmental, pro-environmental decision, I'm at some risk of having somebody say you went too far and you'd have personal liability. And the last important thing I'll say is that what I just described is the Delaware scheme. The scheme in most states that have adopted the benefit corporation model that's generally out there, the protection is not quite as strong. And it varies in a couple ways.
You know, protection for the board or protection for the shareholders who want to enforce the mission?
The protection for the company and the board against decisions.
And the social purpose in the corporation in California matches very closely. We had the same. We wanted to provide some mechanism for enforcement, but we also wanted to ensure that there was additional protection for boards and management, because this is going to be difficult. It's easy if you have the single bottom line. If you are just driving for profitability, and all of your decisions are based on that, and if you take that action, you really, difficult to sue you, that's sort of the easy course. All of a sudden we're saying you have a fiduciary duty to that and to this one or many things. And that can make it very difficult. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the new forms is we're just at the beginning. We are in, we're in sort of the first, the first hit of the first inning. Are we in baseball season yet? Almost. Yes. I'm hopeful, and I'm a Giants fan. Go Giants! Although I do. Huh? All right. I'll shut up.
So
do you want to ask us another question?
I think I might. Just one thought though. The need that you assert for the new corporate form is to make consideration of constituencies mandatory. I think we all agree that it's permissive for the most part in a traditional corporation. So we're making it mandatory, but it sounds like it's a pretty high bar to enforce. So it's sort of mandatory.
It's very mandatory.
Yes. I think the answer is yes, and it's a difficult balance. And look, this isn't going to work unless investors buy into the proposition. In other words, you're not going to be able to have a situation where investors really don't want to do this because I think they will be able to push a board away from really making decisions that are stakeholder oriented. So there is some work to be done and some law to develop here.
But I think what's interesting is that if you place these along a continuum of options, where you have different moments where someone could step in and say, this is where I want to invest, or this is where I want to intervene in a problem. You really look at the nonprofit on one side and the purely for-profit on the other side, and then you have these different way stations where, if something is not, and we look at this a lot in the impact investing world, is at what point do we cross over from something that's charitable to simply impactful? And at what point in this world, when we think about it, at what point our purpose is really charitable versus impactful purposes or good purposes or nice to have purposes or wouldn't it be great purposes or we don't really care purposes? And so then you have this menu of options where different companies and different investors can look at the world in a fairly holistic way, that there are times we would want to intervene for profit and good, at times only for profit, and time really particularly for good. Again, I know that's sort of judgmental a bit, but the idea is that you can pick and choose what things you want in your bucket, as opposed to saying that you can only do one thing or the other thing.
But they're never, and to Rick's point, these have taken off for the most part, the new forms on the smaller scale. But a lot of what's happening with traditional forms building in impact is look at the announcement from Goldman Sachs today. This is now mainstream, part of mainstream business. For it to take off with shareholders, there's a component we haven't talked about yet, and that is being able to accurately measure and report on the social and the environmental impact. And that is key, because if you're going to shareholders and saying, in addition to driving financial return, we also need to have this impact, how you measure it, how you verify it, and how you report it is critical, and that world is in evolution. Erica Karp is here. Erica and I were founding board members of SASB. That movement, for those of you who are not aware, that's a Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, but there are others, the IRC and GRI, that are really taking a lot of the reporting in this area, the social and environmental reporting, which has been more of a kumbaya. Let's figure out what we want to say on this score. We can't be sued. We're going to put out a CSR report. We're going to share our story in the way we want to. What they're doing is taking that data and saying some of those factors related to environmental, social, and governance are material to operations right now, and so really belong in the 10K and the 10Q. And when that's called integrated reporting. And when you get there, then you actually have to figure out how you report, and you have to have somebody, what you're going to report, how you're going to have somebody verify, which is going to be the big, at this point, probably the big accounting firms, to make sure that when you have this duty. And I think it's not going to catch on completely with investors until on the reporting side. I don't know, Rick, if you or Will, agree with that.
Transparency is critical. I mean, this only work. It doesn't work if people say, it's all about being able to distinguish between, good companies and good marketing. And without the transparency piece, and these are all platforms like SASB and Gears, and we have B-Lab has one too, and without some way to actually measure impact, none of this works.
So, as I said last night, because Suze likes to throw these terms around, I think Birkenstocks are really excellent shoes, and I own a pair, and I actually think Kumbaya is a lovely song, much maligned these days. So I've decided to start a company called Kumbaya.com, and we're going to produce a Birkenstock-like shoe. And our mission is to, for every 2 shoes we sell, we're going to donate 1 pair of Birkenstocks. So,
thank you for that.
To the panel, what corporate form should I choose in order to form my enterprise, and how am I most likely to succeed in getting some investment, because I don't have any money, because we're Kumbaya.com.
A low liability company.
low liability L3C.
The L3C.
Seems low profit.
Low profit.
Let me just, one thing I wanted to, I should have said at the beginning, and Rick didn't cover it. People talk about a lot of these new forms as B Corps. A B Corp is a certification. So when you talk about metrics and reporting, a lot of different types of forms can be B Corps. They actually all are about transparency and taking an audit and reporting on a whole variety of environmental, social, and governance factors. So putting B Corps aside, what are the new corporate forms? You have the L3C, which this is the low liability, low profit,
I started you on
low profit limited liability company. You have a variety of different genres of benefit corporations. They're all referred to. There is a model, but they vary very differently. They vary distinctly by state. You have the public benefit corporation and the social purpose corporation, which are more similar in terms of shareholder rights, although there's some differences there. So those are the new forms. Just for a minute, if you really want to have impact, if you're setting up a company or an investor, you really need to think about the new models and also traditional models. There are things you can do with your corporation. Examples of that are you can have a shareholders agreement. You can include protective provisions where one class of shareholders has a right to control the mission and to make sure that the mission doesn't change. You can have information rights in there too, in the investors, to make sure that the company maintains its mission alignment. All of that's with a traditional, Delaware corporation. I wouldn't put it in your charter as a primary mission, but other than that, and then an LLC, by contract, you can agree, LLCs can be as mission aligned or more mission aligned than any of the new corporate forms we have. The only reason that we haven't focused on them, and the L3C is a derivation of that, because by contract you can agree the mission. So I thought I would just give a little survey, and then the other people provide more commentary.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, there's absolutely possible to do these kinds of, but these new corporate forms are kind of attractive because it does make the possibility of doing it a lot more efficient.
So startup costs are important, so I should go with one of these newfangled corporate forms rather than an L3C.
Well, L3C.
But an L3C, I think
Even the
Okay.
even the
I do.
nonprofit.
Yeah.
Let me just ask, has anybody on this panel actually formed an L3C? So that is your answer. L3Cs were a very, very good idea that had not taken.
Well-intentioned.
Well, it was
I've worked for some
extremely well
low-profit
intentioned.
companies, however.
Yes. Okay.
And they were designed to address one specific thing. At the heart of it was to attract program-related investment capital from private foundations. So PRIs, for people who don't know, PRIs are it's a charitable vehicle that only private foundations can do, and it essentially takes an investment form and says you can make an investment, but it's really a grant, and you have to do it for a charitable purpose, and you can't be doing it to make any money. And if you do this, we will treat it as a grant for all tax purposes, so that it can qualify for your distribution, which private foundations have to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a whole host of tax benefits.
Tober.
Yes,
I mean, just for posterity.
Yes.
You're allowed to make money on program-related investments.
yes.
You just have to have a primary focus on the mission.
You
Is
can
that
even
not
end up
correct?
making a lot of money.
You can make a lot of money, but you can make a lot of money. But they were designed to bake the PRI requirements of the tax code into an LLC model. And so, unlike some of the other corporate forms, which I think were designed to address bigger problems, this was a much narrower problem that it was trying to solve for. But the federal tax benefits don't flow with it, so it doesn't make it useful for a lot of what my clients do, for example.
Questions?
Sorry, Doug?
Yeah, I was wondering how companies like Tom's or Warby Parker, who have a mission as well as a mandate to maximize profits, they're using regular corporate forms. Do they incur obligations to uphold their mission as well?
I believe Warby Parker may be a public benefit corporation.
Warby Parker is certified B Corporation, but they're not a public benefit corporation
It was
yet.
Kickstarter that became.
Kickstarter
Became
became a public
So
benefit
if you are a traditional corporate form, the easiest way is to have your mission directly related to your profitability. So the example is Etsy. Etsy is a certified B Corp, but they're a normal corporate Delaware corporation. So how do they maintain their mission? They maintain their mission. There's some companies that will use all the things we talked about, the shareholders agreement, the protective provisions. My favorite is actually a license. You take valuable IP, you leave it with the founder, you put it in a nonprofit, license it in, make sure there's a mission lock in that license. The license then terminates if they deviate. It's a little more complicated than that. So those are all mechanisms to make sure. But if you have a company like Etsy or like my client Revolution Foods, some of these companies where the mission and the profitability are inextricably linked. Revolution Foods, the more they educate kids on nutrition, the more kids buy their healthy lunches. It is directly linked, the mission and the profitability. They don't really need them because it is part and parcel of what they're doing. I don't know if you guys agree, and then we have more questions.
No, I absolutely agree.
So I'll do the disagree then on that.
Okay, Rick,
And say,
go ahead.
No question that I think everything Sue said is correct to the extent that you can definitely do many good things and extend your mission. As a traditional corporation, what I'd say though that taking one of these forms like the Public Benefit Corporation in Delaware or Benefit Corporation in other states, is a tool you can use to further that mission, and you lock it in through changes in control and changes in you could get a new management where they're not so interested in they're selling food in schools, but they're kind of maybe sort of falling down on the nutrition, and you just sort of have mission creep, so this is very much a way to lock it in. So if Jordan was starting his Birkenstock company, I might suggest if you form as a benefit corporation, then as you bring in new rounds of investment, as you do some sort of exit, whether it's an IPO or an M&A exit, you've locked in that mission.
I agree with that.
Sorry.
Yes.
Kind of two-pronged question. So for the L3C, you said that it was created in order to be able to absorb and even attract program-related investments, actually as a grant. Would there be any disincentive to form a firm as an L3C if you were trying to attract both that kind of investment and standard angel investment? process.
You wouldn't ever
wouldn't.
form
You
an
wouldn't have an
L3C,
L3C.
which is why none of us
But we
ever
didn't
have.
do it, so that.
You know,
Yeah.
it is, so the L3C, while is mission first. So if I were teaching my class and I had a continuum, if we had the nonprofit here and the for-profit here, and I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about hybrids, because a lot of what we all still do is blend the two together in kind of interesting ways. But nonprofit, for-profit, the L3C is closest to the nonprofit, has to be mission first. And mainstream investors will not invest in it.
And it doesn't provide you the benefit you need on the nonprofit side. So it sits out there in a weird way that's,
The initial purpose in some ways was not realized.
Right.
It did not actually really grease the skids
Is it
for
a dying breed?
I
Or
think-
was it never allowed?
I think,
I think there are a lot of companies, if you don't need to scale and you don't need to take outside capital and you really want to be mission aligned and mission first and you are, locally held, kind of like a cooperative, although we're playing with cooperative forms too, it can be a very good model.
Yeah.
But you can't use it to attract outside capital and scale.
and I've
Is that
had
fair, guys?
nonprofits have set up L3Cs as their subsidiaries. Again, more for optics than anything else. And so we dealt with that. But it was really, again, to Susan's point, sort of nestled against the nonprofit side of the continuum as opposed to moving out.
So let's say you have a company that's, explicitly built for a social enterprise, but wants to explicitly move kind of mainstream investors towards believing that long-term shareholder, profit maximization is achievable. And let's say the company has, a great board of directors that's totally on board with it. And let's say they believe that transparency around the most material environmental and social and governance factors is critical. And let's say they figure out how to be transparent and measure this stuff.
Right.
I just would want to understand and let's say they want to be mainstream, so they're a C Corp. What is the biggest deficit doing all those things and defining, long-term profitability as being consistent with societal imperatives? What is the biggest deficit? If we've got those things that are governance issues and transparency issues, what's the biggest deficit to the current traditional corporate form? You've got reporting, you've got transparency, disclosure, governance, you're aligned with your shareholders because you want.
I'll repeat what Rick said. I would say, I agree, because we actually didn't disagree. Mission creep, that the current management of the board changes, and then all of the emphasis of the company doesn't, it's not like Revolution Foods is going to start selling cigarettes tomorrow. It's like, companies don't whole scale, but there is creep in terms of what they do, what they do. So one is, and the second is change of control. So the other thing that Rick said, which I agree with, at the time of change of control, if the company you are mentioning comes in and there's somebody who wants to pay $100, $100 for the per share, but they're not going to maintain the mission, and somebody's going to offer 50. Maybe if it's 195 and you hire somebody like Rick and they can argue that 95 is actually for the better for the company long term, because it's not strictly just the money, but it's a lot about the money. Then the new forms combat them. The issue with the new forms and why a lot of companies, it is growing. There are a lot of investors who don't understand them. There is not case law yet around a lot of the issues. How we are going to weight, has the tested, have what we built into the SBC and the PBC been tested in terms of the additional prophylactic of the business judgment rule protecting boards and management making the decisions? That's all yet to come. So if you are a mainstream investor looking at this, and you are looking at a new company that has a new idea, and they've got a new management team and a new form, I often advise the company to wait a little bit until these have grown up a little bit. You can enter into a shareholders agreement that says at a certain point we're going to convert if these factors are met, but some investors are not as comfortable. I think the first PBC going public, Laureate, is a huge step in the right direction, because a lot of this is going to be tested, and at some point we're going to have litigation, and we're going to see in Delaware courts how it turns out.
Yeah, and another thing I'd say, Erica, is like, to me, the deficit is, you can sort of say all these things are aligned, but when you sort of have to sit down across the table from your stakeholder, let's say, the guy who the best presentation I heard on this was from Max Ventilla at Alt School. So that's a venture-backed education company. and they do a lot of work. Their vision will be to do a lot of work for various school districts. And he said, I want to be able to sit down across from the guy, from the school district and say, we are in this for you, our stakeholder, and the students, as much as we're in it for our investors. And I mean, in some ways, it's a paradox. By being able to make that commitment, you're actually able to create more value, and it's better for the investors. So the deficit you're trying to overcome with these new forms is the ability to commit, to make an authentic commitment to other stakeholders, not a commitment that's contingent on that that relationship continuing to maximize value for stockholders.
And just on that, Will, you probably don't remember this conversation, but we had a conversation after the law in California passed. And I think I asked you, was it worth it? And you sheepishly shrugged your shoulders and you said, not sure, but it's from an optical standpoint, it's a really good thing. And listening to what Rick is saying and then hearing this conversation to your question, it's almost as if the form save us from our more baser instincts away from that will move away from the things we think we care about. And in the sense that now it's all good. I have a funny Revolution food story, which I'm not going to tell in public, but I'll tell you after. But
it doesn't involve cigarettes.
It doesn't involve cigarettes. It involves my children and their school and a change in food service. But at the heart of the question of expansion and the pressures of growing a company to scale and responding to other pressures of investors, you sometimes lose that initial spark of why we did this. And what you're saying, and what I've heard from other people as well, is that one, the optics of it, we say it publicly, we say it out loud, and we have to mean it because the law says we have to mean it. And we can talk to our stakeholders and say we can't do that because it's baked into who we are. And I think that's what I've heard from other people. Again, you look skeptical, but that's one of those things that it means a lot when you say something out loud and you have to be held to it.
Just as a follow, the reason I look like I'm skeptical is just because this is all so gray, right? And so if we're looking for perfection, not going to happen. But if we're looking for...
Not yet. We're working on it.
We're working on it. I'm not waiting for it. But if you try to figure out, like for a company that's arguing it's transitioning its mission and it's going to be consistent and it's going to be for the benefit of long term, but who's to decide what the scale and the speed of the transition should be? I mean, it's the board ultimately with what's acceptable, and it's the investors. And then if you're doing right by your customers, you're doing right by your employees, and long term you're doing right by the company. So to me, this is just, it's so unbelievably gray. I don't know who gets to decide, the magnitude and the pace of any of these questions of stakeholder alignment.
Well, I'll say it's gone, and when we were at Ceres at the UN, this has gone mainstream so much faster than I ever imagined. I mean, it used to be it was much more in Tomer's realm. I mean, impact and all of this was an expansion of philanthropy. And then we had a lot of people who were impact investors who were looking at making money and doing good. And now we have a whole bunch of people who are just focused on making money, and they want to make sure they have positive and not negative impacts. And so this is happening really fast, and a lot of this is going to get tested real time. But if we're aspirational, if the reason for the corporate forum for me is quarterly reporting, stock options, and the most important, climate change, if we're actually going to affect change in a very quick way, shifting the fiduciary duties of a board and management, they'll have discretion on how they weight it to shareholder agreed environmental goals, can be a game changer. You've heard me say this before.
So we have some questions on the other side of the aisle.
That's all right.
Joel, you want to pick up?
So I guess you could define social impact in a billion different ways, and everybody
Yes.
can look at it differently. At bottom, are you trying to recreate or create a new corporate, a better corporate form that ultimately everybody could use, no matter what your social...
Oh, we have those forms now,
Or
yes.
are you trying to mimic an existing corporate form? Maybe try to make a new animal in which anybody could shoehorn into?
The answer to that, but we'd have to kill you because it's a secret plan.
No, we designed the ones that, so the benefit corporation is different state by state, and there are some issues with benefit corporations in some of the states, but the public benefit and the social purpose corporation our new corporate forms. They look and feel and act like existing corporations because we want them to function within the existing corporate world and take mainstream capital and go public and engage in M&A, and there will be a lot of litigation, and but they are new forms.
And I'd say, like, one of the objections that we sometimes get to benefit corporation is, well, if you have this form, it's going to give all the other corporations an excuse to just, spew out carbon, et cetera, et cetera. I really don't think it's going to work that way.
Or vice versa, where everybody says, we're going to become a benefit corporation, we just define the benefit.
You mean our benefit is we're going to add carbon to the atmosphere, and we think that's good for everyone?
Well, that's in the statute. You can't do that. The statute actually the statutes borrow from the nonprofit code in setting there. You can't just have any mission. My mission can't be we're gonna take the money from MoFo and move it to Tahiti. I mean, it's like, while that might be fun, Joel, we can't do that. So each of the statutes, one of the differences between a benefit corporation and the SBC and the PBC is the benefit corporation has actually tried to legislate good. So they've taken the B-Lab standard and said, you can't be a benefit corporation unless you actually focus on this sort of longer list of social and environmental. But the public benefit corporation, I just focus on that, you have to have a general public good. In addition, you have to, within this prescribed realm, it's almost like, the exempt purpose of a nonprofit, you have to have some shareholder agreed mission that promotes good. What is defined as goodness? Is that, Rick, am I? Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, just to build on what Joel said, you can look at the pros and cons of the insurgency, but then there's sort of what is the, to Erica's point, what are the pros and cons of the current regime? And they are the flip sides of the same coin, obviously, but I think my sense of what you're trying to do is you're trying to replace the current regime bit by bit over time.
Yes.
When you look at what is happening, happened to NRG, to David Crane, just what's driving on now to do what they're doing. We have significant structural, infrastructural problems in the way shareholders can think long term. And so, I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but it seems to me that what you're trying to do is incrementally build towards a model that replaces the current regime.
So as a participant in this, to some extent, although we're a traditional corporate form, P corporation, I think, I sort of agree with you, but I think the people who are doing this are trying to prove a point, which is that you can do good, you can achieve a social purpose, and you can make a profit. So if this works, hopefully more people will follow. I don't think we're trying to force everybody into our mold. There's going to be people who don't care about things we care about, and they can use or not use one of these corporate forms. But I think a lot of this is to convince the world, and particularly the investing community and the legal community, the judicial community, that this can all be done in a way that's attractive.
Convince and give an opportunity to do it
And at
without
some
being
point, hopefully, it's
hoisted by
attraction.
corporate law.
Yeah, it's attraction as opposed to,
Right.
these companies become so successful and recognizing that, Cornerstone Capital becomes the best in class because it does these things, and everybody wants to be like
Right.
them.
As we were talking about before too, it's inserting a level of intentionality about it, and I think that, kind of to your point before, one of the things that's such a proof point to me is, talking with sort of traditional Silicon Valley and, venture investors who are really, really skeptical about this stuff a few years ago, and now, in 8 or 10 deals, they're right there along with us. And why? Not because they're suddenly, converted to, we believe we should have a mission. They're great, successful companies. And they're, it's like, okay, whatever your mission is, whatever this thing is, it's an investment they want to make. And so I think somebody, attributed to Warren Buffett, somebody to Mark Andreessen about impact investing. It's like a houseboat, neither a good house nor a good boat. And yet, nevertheless, they're finding investments that totally align with this. So.
Two questions, one here, and then you'll be.
So what I'm struck by is, one is about the mission, and one's about how you do your business, how you
Yeah.
conduct business.
Right.
So go back to Kumbaya. And right now, this is the CEO of Kumbaya. Is your mission to give away shoes? What is your mission?
Well, that's a fair question, and I have some, I did that example on purpose because in my mind, I'm not entirely convinced that a company that makes any product and gives one away
Right.
is entirely, I wouldn't call it a social enterprise. Nevertheless, I think they're doing some good. So our mission would be to make fantastic shoes and incidentally to create some benefit for people who don't have shoes.
So
That's part
you're
of our-
giving to people, so let's just say you decided shoes was not just to not make sense,
Yeah,
and you now wanted to give away hats and gloves,
Yeah.
to people who live in cold places or whatever. In this scenario, because I can understand investors think they're investing in shoes being given away, right? Or are they investing in a company that is, for every shoe they sell, they give one away. So in that scenario, you as the CEO, what flexibility do you have to decide that is your mission around the shoes, or is your mission about providing clothing of some sort to people that don't have it? Like, what can you do? Like,
right. Is it poverty alleviation or something?
Right.
Which one of us is
there
gonna-
something
we're
in
ready
how
for
you
this.
craft your
Rick, you wanna
mission
go?
to give you,
Well,
do you craft your mission in a certain way? Is there an art to crafting your mission to give you as the CEO the flexibility you need to shift how you go about fulfilling on it, so you're not stuck?
Yeah, and just to be clear, like, this issue would only come, like, if you were a benefit corporation in a outside of Delaware, this issue wouldn't come up in the sense that, I mean, you could have a specific benefit, but you could probably just have a general benefit. If you're a Delaware Public Benefit Corporation,
Or a California Social Purpose Corporation.
you have to have a specific benefit in addition in Delaware to your general benefit. So, yes, there's an art to crafting that.
It's apparel, it's
And-
not shoes.
Yeah, and I mean, and we have a memo and talks about how to sort of be not too specific, not too general, just sort of a Goldilocks solution of just right.
But for me, it's about the shareholders. So I want to craft the mission, and actually, I want to take it to the hybrid world or to the world of funds and fund formation. So we do this a lot with funds, aggregating capital. I'm going to determine and disclose to my investors clearly what I'm going to do. Am I driving for returns, but I want to measure my impact? Am I driving for returns, but I might mitigate my returns because I'm going to have an impact? What am I focused on in terms of impact? All of that you draft into the LP or LLC agreement, and then you just fully disclose it. And it's the same thing with the public benefit and the social purpose. You put it in a way, and then the shareholders invest know what you are, and then the Delaware and the California have provisions that if you change it, you have to go to the shareholder and get shareholders' approval. So if he put it in his mission, he's going to be all about shoes. To me, it's about the shoes and giving away. It's also about how he's making the shoes. So in this world, you have
about that part.
and in this world, you have companies where a lot of impact investing is, and these new forms are. It's clearly when the output is positive for the society or advances the cause. When you're in renewable energy or energy efficiency, or you're creating jobs and workplaces for the unemployed, your output is positive in itself. There's also a whole element of this where I think it's even more important for the cigarette makers of the world, for oil and gas, which is we've got to produce things, and right now we can't live without traditional oil and gas. And so can we figure out how the people who are making the microphones, the people who are making the chairs, the people who are making stuff that is not considered good in and of itself, although these chairs are quite comfortable, how can they do that more, in a better way, more sustainably? How can they reduce carbon? How can they, treat their employees in a more positive way? How can they create more employment for the unemployed and dispossessed? That whole process is also a very important component of this.
There's this woman's been very patiently waiting, so please, yes.
I work in the infrastructure arena, specifically the water and wastewater infrastructure arena. Given that there are two people on this panel that are from law firms with very big infrastructure finance departments, where do you see these forms that you're talking about, these corporate forms, new and existing ones, working in developing and implementing the necessary infrastructure projects, not only in this country, but around the world, whether it's water projects, energy projects, transportation projects?
I have thought about that because we've married the impact with sort of our energy and infrastructure group, and we actually met with a private equity firm this morning. And the answer is you would so when you do those investments, you always do them and you separate the assets and have a project company that is owning the assets. When you LLCs, yeah, exactly. and it's LLC SPVs. And so in the SPV itself, you actually put in sort of a mission lock. And this doesn't have to be, you could use the new corporate forms. I haven't seen that yet. But you, in terms of you structure the LLC and you draft in, and just like we talked about, you specifically agree, if you're, in this case, we're representing the private equity investor. And for me, I'm as interested in ensuring the mission as I am in disclosure. Because if you're in energy and infrastructure, renewable energy and infrastructure, and you're going to reduce carbon, you got to figure out how to verify and report in a way that the U.S. government can use for purposes of COP21. And that's going to be critical, and that's not happening at the project level yet, and that has to happen at the project level. Sorry, I've been thinking about that.
Can we
Tell me
turn
what
to
it
the topic of tandem or hybrid organization? We've talked about these different forms sort of in isolation, but you guys deal with things like hybrids and tandems or whatever. Can you explain what that is and how those might attack the problem?
I live in one. And there are many flavors of them. I mean, for us as an investor, as I said, we combine a private foundation and a venture fund, and actually it's got one staff, one mission, one board, and so that we can really seamlessly figure out basically what is the right tool to approach the right problem. But from the company side, they come in a lot of flavors, and I guess as Susan and I said, 10 years ago, I think we were super excited about them as the bright and shiny thing, and now, I think there are times when they're really critical and times when it's unnecessarily complicated. But, I've seen, for example, not-for-profits that suddenly see a revenue-generating opportunity that is absolutely fitting with the mission, or at least absolutely, supporting the mission, may or may not, produce unrelated business income, and so they realize that they should spin out a for-profit that they can really keep a mission lock on because they're going to have an ownership interest in it, they're going to have a board interest in it, and allow that for-profit, activity to happen, which will subsidize the not-for-profit activities. I see them where they're basically in tandem, they're sort of, brother-sister organizations. Many forms, but basically that, and I guess for me, one of the things that Susan and I have talked about a lot that becomes an issue is there are all kinds of cultural issues around it. If you really are having you're still raising grant funding, you're doing stuff that really is sort of a pure not-for-profit activity, and then you also really have an income generating thing that can't fit within the nonprofit, that's great. But if they're a little bit more mixed, there become all kinds of issues about, governance issues. You really do have to have two separate boards, sort of brain drain issues. If you basically sort of all have the same mission, you'll have a lot of staff saying, well, why am I still working for the not-for-profit? Is this for-profit over here with the same mission? So that's a beginning of that.
I'll just say, I have never, a cash-starved startup, I would never, ever advise them to set up a tandem or hybrid structure, because if you think about it, sort of taking a step back, you have a nonprofit who is, and this is Tomer's world, fully mission aligned. They've got the IRS, they've got the Attorney General. They're like, you've got to use those resources for mission. If you're talking about a hybrid, then you've either got a nonprofit here, or here, or here, and you've got ownership interest, you've got shared resources, shared employees, probably shared IP, money running back and forth. I don't know a lot about nonprofit law, but the nonprofit the whole code has said you can't use these nonprofit assets to benefit a for-profit. So what you practically have to do to make it work is you have to track the services and the people and the IP and the funds, and really keep careful track and make sure that at all times the for-profit is paying at least market or more than market to the nonprofit. And you got to measure it and monitor it over time, and you got to have corporate governance to make sure it's been all set up right. But for the startup, if you're cash starved, and one of the things that I really worry about in this space is the number of people who think this is a good idea and they set it up and they think they're doing it right, and they just haven't scaled, so the IRS will audit them. But if they actually become successful and get to about $2 million, somebody's going to look at them, and most of them that I see are actually not doing it right, which is why you call somebody like Tomer.
I think what's interesting is the nonprofit rules are rooted in traditional notions of charity, going way back. And what we all do when we look at this, particularly in the hybrid situation or in the commerciality realm, is we try and figure out how the nonprofit can exist in this world that it's not supposed to be in. And we're all very creative about this, and we find ways to do it, but there are limitations. And so when someone comes to me and they say, should I set up a for-profit, should I set up a nonprofit? It's like, listen, unless you really, really, really want to be in the nonprofit space, don't be there. Because you're going to hit a wall at some point, and you're going to get to this place where you're going to want to do all the things that you really wanted to do, but you didn't tell me about in the beginning because you wanted to attract grant funding, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to want to do those things, and then you're going to keep hitting that wall. And, it's, even in the hybrid context, and maybe you can talk about your beginnings and how you evolved as an organization, but, charity doesn't give you a lot of flexibility. And it gives you some benefits. It gives you the contribution deduction. It gives you tax exemption. There are a lot of trade-offs to being a charity. And there's the halo effect that people love charities, though I think that's disappearing a little more with these getting back to the optics of some of these new forms. People like seeing this stuff in writing, in legislation, that this is what we do. But charities are tough. And so, they often become necessary in the context of what for-profits are doing because there's streams of money that a for-profit can't access. There are types of grants that they can't get. There's government programs that they want to take advantage of. But it's really hard to move in and out of for-profit, nonprofit without really tripping over yourself.
But some of the forms, I'll give you a couple examples of Midyar, but we set up Kepler's, which is sort of the first of the independent bookstores to survive in the wake of Amazon. So what we did is we broke apart the arts and lectures and made that a nonprofit, and we have the for-profit bookseller, and it's working beautifully. And in terms of, and that model has now been replicated with about 20 independent booksellers. Another example is Medicines 360, big, large nonprofit, devices and advancement in women's health, and particularly reproductive health, believing that they are basically a nonprofit big pharma. They developed a device that is now out there in the market, and it was so it was such a cool device. Big pharma came and said, hey, we want it too, and so we basically structured a $600 million licensing deal with Big Pharma. So Big Pharma is now taking that product and selling it to women in the private sector, and the nonprofit is still selling well below cost in the public sector. And the money that is being made on this licensing deal is going to fund a whole bunch of new cool and exciting things in women's health. And I just get so excited. So we've sort of talked, and Omidyar's ability as a hybrid to affect real change. When you look at impact investors in the space, they're one of the leaders. And one of the reasons that they can do it is they can do grant funding and they can do investment. And it gives them a lot of power and creativity. It's just not for the faint at heart. So I didn't want to poo-poo hybrids too much.
No, there's definitely a place and a good way to use them, but I think there's a lot of structuring that you need to pay attention to.
You have to spend time with these people. Yeah.
So let's. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say one of the more awkward conversations that I feel like we'll have at a Midyar network is the young, sort of new entrepreneur, and we often come in, really early, and they're thinking about how to. They got their idea. They may even be building their team, but they're not sure yet what form to use. And the awkward conversation is basically, we think we're a for-profit, but if things don't work out, maybe we're a not-for-profit. This is the conversation.
Let me say, Tomer will back this up. Making an investment and then having it suck. You can't all of a sudden turn it into a donation.
Right. Although,
is that not true?
That is, yes.
Yes, that is true. Yeah, but for a Midyar,
But yeah, you can't have a hybrid be the same organization, right? That's.
Yeah.
Do you see hybrids persisting and being successful in certain industries more so than others? And I sort of say this from personal experience with an education startup, where the product, the buyer could be an individual parent, it could be an independent school that can pay for it, or it could be a foundation which basically buys the product on behalf of someone who can't afford to buy it. So is it industry specific and sort of more?
I'm seeing a lot of hybrids in nonprofits. Of course, in nonprofits. A lot of hybrids in healthcare, life sciences, education, where there's a strong component. They also, they really only work when they can't compete at all. But you can have overlap in terms of client base, and there is a synergy there. And you can, well, Tomer would hate this, we sort of dress up and do sort of dual offerings where you can go out to the same people and say, make a donation and invest. And as long as it's not integrated, it can be a very compelling story. I think that's why a lot of startups are like, hey, I can do both. And they don't have the resources to manage it well. And so it all becomes commingled. And that is very difficult to unwind and fix later.
I'll give you another example from another part of my world, which is this new media organization, First Look Media. The absolute, core purpose of it is about First Amendment and advocating for, great independent investigative journalism. And, as PR said at one point, I and maybe 10,000 other people in the country really care about the First Amendment. A lot more people should. And so if we're really going to make a change about this, we really need to be able to reach millions of people, not, tens of thousands of people. And so, for the core journalism part, we hosted it in a not-for-profit. And that was about, having the mission lock. If, everybody got hit by a bus. It's about having the transparency, and it's about separating editorial control from investors. Basically, they're no investors, they're grant makers. And so, big issue with a lot of other journalism outfits. But at the same time, we're building out a series of for-profit entities around that are certainly mission aligned, but are absolutely about making money and bringing in a mass audience. So it's a little bit like, here's your sugar, here's the medicine kind of thing. So I think that's a useful version of it. But really what we're doing is we're working with the existing IRS corporate structures to do something that they didn't anticipate, basically. So it's not that we're opposed to the IRS rules, it's that we're thinking in an orthogonal way and doing our best to sort of create, with a lot of help from people, create structures that will, use the existing forms to accomplish a new purpose.
And just one comment on where we are on the nonprofit side is that the nonprofit sector has gotten commercial very fast. And it's pushed much faster than the IRS and the regulators understand into the commercial world. And given where the IRS is and where people are in their conception of charity and philanthropy, that the next thing a lot of us are worried about is the backlash against commerciality. That people will say, and regulators will say, this is not a place where a nonprofit should be. You get tax benefits, you get other benefits. You should not be commercial. We should make that distinction. As opposed to what the market is doing, which is blending the two, or the three, or the four, or the five, whatever we think about the continuum. And the market is moving much farther ahead of the regulator. And, one of the things that I worry about all the time is when our regulator wakes up from its disastrous last 3 years with Tea Party scandals and this scandal and that scandal, and realizes that the sector is so far away from where it is, and it doesn't know what to do because it's not sophisticated enough to really react in a useful way. And that's just something that when we think about hybrids and when we think about, to Will's point of blending things and using the rules in ways that they weren't intended but that are permissible and make sense in light of where we are as a sector or a couple of sectors, that the IRS is not going to know how to react to that, nor will state regulators, nor will people on the Hill who are populist who believe that charities should do X and should not do A through Z or whatever the other amounts are.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's the likelihood if you put together a hybrid of being audited by the IRS, even now in their current state of array, is high, particularly once you reach a certain size level in terms of budget and revenue, and it's only going to get higher. And that just argues for, again, thinking about flow of people and services and thinking about flow of money and IP and really making sure that you separate it and you have good governance, and you have good governance in terms of regular review, because I've also never seen one of these that even if we set it up and it's beautiful at the time, all of them evolve and change over time. And so you've got to have a process to be able to say, a built-in process to say on a quarterly basis, we're going to be tracking and having reporting. It goes back to our transparency. And then we're going to have an independent mechanism to be able to change those agreements and modify the flow, how the payments are running back and forth. And that's the only way, having lived through, the first one, I set up in '99, having lived through a number of these audits. The IRS is also not yet sophisticated in what they're asking yet. It's a little more form over substance, and so this is being recorded. I'm going to stop there. I had one final question because Jordan had to step out for just a second, and just have all of us comment on kind of where we see the sector around new forms and fiduciary duties going over the next couple of years, and then we're welcome to take more questions. I asked your questions, more questions, and that's it. You can see why we all care so much about corporate form. Well, why don't we do the Tomer? We're just in a minute. Sure. Where are we headed? More hybrids?
I think we just have more options, and I think the way hybrids are utilized will be more sophisticated in the context of what we already have out there, and will give people, similar to what I said earlier, a menu of options to choose from so that they can be in the right place given what they want to do. And that will refine, hopefully, the structures that the new corporate forms, and hopefully reform how nonprofits and charities interact with the for-profit world. But impact exists along this continuum, and we should strive to hit every point of that continuum in order to change things.
My turn?
Yeah.
So, I'll talk sort of about where I see the future of stakeholder governance going. And I think where I see the future is in some ways going back to the past, because what we didn't talk about on this panel is sort of the whole history of how we got to a place where we thought we needed to have a form that said, if you're this corporation that has perpetual existed, limited liability, the ability to contract, all these gifts, from the government, the idea that you could run that to just maximize value for stockholders and the rest of the world be damned, it's kind of a crazy idea. And we didn't talk about how we got there. And that's not really where we were 60 or 70 years ago. 60 or 70 years ago, believe it or not, executives ran corporations as mediators among stakeholders. And you could go and find quotes from, the chairman of GM just saying to the market, this is what I think my job is. And that just changed in the late 80s for a lot of reasons. And I do think we are making moves back in all kinds of ways to stakeholder governance. We've got an IPO right now going on of a KKR-backed benefit corporation.
Public benefit corporation.
We've got Natura, which is a publicly traded, $5 billion market cap company in Brazil, but their investors are global. They voted to amend their charter to have stakeholder governance. B-Lab's working with a group of multinational companies across the world, like including Danone and Unilever, to bring this to multinational companies and public companies. And one more thing we didn't get a chance to talk about where we're seeing this is a lot of public companies are converting significant subsidiaries. Campbell's Soup, Unilever, they're all converting subsidiaries to benefit corporations as a way of getting their toe in the water.
From a little bit different perspective, I don't think they're going away, although I do think some of these corporate forms may help to bring this stuff back together rather than these hybrids, which are a little bit, architected around these issues. I think some of these new corporate forms can actually kind of bring them back together. And one of the more positive things that I've seen over the last few years, working with other family offices and family foundations and high net worth individuals who are trying to figure out their philanthropy, there's going to be over the next, I guess it's happening now, but over the next 10, 15 years, one of the largest wealth transfers in history, from generation to generation. And we've been doing a lot of work with the Giving Pledge, and there's a whole group, I think one of the largest contingency of it, has gotten very excited about impact investing, 40 to 50 of these families. And for the younger generation, call them the millennials and below, having these conversations like the grandparents and the parents are sort of interested in this and curious and asking sort of why. And this is a lot of the generation where it's like you spend a lot of your life making money, and then you spend the last part of your life giving it away. And for their children and grandchildren, it is completely obvious that these things should be combined. The idea that their investment is going to be combined with their desire to change the world is like, I think of it as sort of like, digital natives. These are like impact investing natives. For them, they're like, why would we do anything else? Which I think is, very exciting. And I talk a lot with, lawyers and other practitioners who are trying to get their heads around this and think, is this something I should take seriously? And, how hard is it and how risky is it? And my feeling is, now you can be asking those questions, but in 10 to 15 years, if you want to still have a practice, you need to figure this stuff out because your new clients are going to demand it from you.
And I'll just riff on what Will just said. I think for a long time, and even at the firm, a couple of my partners are here, this was viewed as an extension of philanthropy. And in terms of my practice, that's that good stuff that Suze does on the side. But, get back to your mainstream deals for Intel or SoftBank or whatever. And what I've been most struck by, and has really accelerated over the last 2 years in a way, much faster than this is why it's better to be lucky than smart. All of a sudden, it's like about the hottest thing. And it really is going mainstream. It is out of sort of an extension of philanthropy, although the work of the family offices and the endowments are still critical. And it really is, when I sold Imprint to Goldman Sachs, and then Goldman Sachs, launches new funds just dedicated to this. And when I have their entire investment team, like wanting me to come and talk to them and educate them on new corporate forms so they understand what's coming, we're in a sea change. And I still think, I think we're further ahead on corporate forms because of people like Rick and others in terms of thinking in a very thoughtful way about how you can shift the fiduciary duties. And I think the next step is we've got to be able to measure and verify and report. So, we can actually get the information. And at Goldman, it's all about, okay, Suze, and when we play with debt and equity instruments, which we do a lot in blending impact in, how are we going to value that? First of all, there's going to be a category of things where you can have a lot of good and make a lot of return. But if you're going to concede that you might have less of a return or focus less on the return for some social or environmental goal, what is the price of that? And it'd be great if we got to a world where we didn't have to have that discussion, but we're in a world, and this is going into the mainstream capital markets, and so how you can look at that and how you can price it and how you can measure it. So even I can say, if you can't price it, but I'm going to allow you to have this impact, I want to make sure if I put my kids' 529 funds, and I have 3 fabulous boys, and I really would like them to go to college, and if I'm going to put them in your fund, I'm going to say, okay, you're going to be an impact fund, and you're going to make money, but you're also going to have this impact. I want to make sure that you're actually having that impact. And that means not singing Kumbaya, no offense, not doing what everybody's been doing on reporting, but reporting on ESG in a way that is consistent and the same as financial returns. And that, I think, is key. Sorry. That was my little... And all of this, I think, can be like a fundamental driver of change in the world. Do you want to say anything, Jordan? I asked the question, dude.
Barely awake. Not that wasn't.
He was sick and he came to moderate just because he's...
So maybe there are some questions from the audience. Yeah.
Just have one. If you're familiar with it, can you discuss the Zuckerberg structure and why there's any sort of controversy around that? There's a charitable thing that he created.
The what structure?
Zuckerberg Chan initiative.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of resonance with the way BDR is structured, which is that the idea is that I think just from that they are interested in doing investing as well as grant making, and they have I think they're going to take on a lot of different initiatives, and basically they're absolutely driven by impact and not about tax advantage. And so this is some kind of amazing statements were made in the press about, they're going to get this wild tax advantage because they're going to keep it, on the contrary, they're completely foregoing. But to the extent it's through an LLC, they're foregoing, a tax advantage. And I think, it's early days. That's a lot of money and, a lot of work to think about how to organize that and get it done. And I think there could, be things that they would create foundations for along the way. But it's really about maximum flexibility to be able to do grant making, to be able to do investing, to be able to do policy work.
I think it's a reflection of the fact that the nonprofit form is, and especially the foundation form, which they would be private foundation, is flawed. And in fact, all of, we've had Gates, we've had lots of foundations that have been, devoting, a lot of money for a very long time on problems and not affecting the kind of impact, and in fact being able to channel the markets. And so that's why he did it. And the backlash is really he put it in a for-profit form. So what, again, is going to be the oversight to make sure he's doing good? He can blend impact into the LLC, and he needs to communicate better. And I actually think the Omidyar model is better, where you leave your funds up top in a trust. It will make a lot of money. Don't drop them down to a foundation. Everybody just does that, not for mission, but for tax reasons. So just if people are watching this, or advising, don't do that. Leave it up top in a trust, and then drop down each year what you need for the foundation or for the for-profit. You have a lot more flexibility. I don't think that there will be the backlash. Sorry, Tomer, I'll let you.
But I just
is that sorry to break in. So is your contention that because of the lack of effect that foundations have had, that's due to the corporate form of that nonprofits?
Well, let Tomer talk. Tomer's the nonprofit.
So I think there are a couple of things. I'm not sure it's necessarily about the foundation, the efficacy of foundation activities. And that's a whole different conversation, I think, about measurement and about how foundations operate and so on and so forth.
Whether they use their endowments for good. Sorry.
But I think when we think, for me, the issue around the uproar or the conversation around the gift or the non-gift is, when I've described it to people, I say think about it as if they wanted to draw a box around a different aspect of their lives, namely their impact piece of their lives. They wanted to create infrastructure, they wanted to draw a box around it, they wanted to dedicate money to it, they wanted to brand it, and they wanted to figure it out. And the uproar, I think, is that we're so entrenched to believe in charity as a certain thing. To Will's point, they will do a ton of charity in there. A lot of their money will go to charities. They might have foundations in there. They might have foundations that they create. They might have foundations they support. But at the end of it, the problem was that people viewed it through the lens of what you're traditionally expected to do. Namely, take all your money, you put it in the Gates Foundation. Take all your money, you put it in the Ford Foundation. Take all your money and put it in, the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation. Whatever it is, take your money and put it into a foundation, spend it out of the foundation, and then you've done something good. We can trust you suddenly because we have built that halo around your foundation. In my mind, all they did was they structured their future giving in a way that, to Will's point and Sue's point about the idea of flexibility and what they want to do.
And Tomer, I think, would agree. You have from Rockefeller's time a whole bunch of laws governing how foundations run, which make it difficult to have. You can't have the flexibility you have in terms of making investments. You have to do them as PRIs or MRIs. They're all of that. Whereas if you have a for-profit form, you can do whatever the heck you want. You also have the endowment issue and whether it is. I mean, you can comment on this. Whether it is required, the view of most of the large foundations in this country that they will spend and make money on the revenue from the trust, but the trustees hold the corpus of the trust, sacred, and they're not. I mean, maybe they're negative screening to make sure they're not invested in coal, but they're not using that to advance impact. Tomer, would you agree?
Yeah, and I think that's a whole separate conversation around this division between endowment and program. And more people are thinking about how to align the investment activities with their program. Again, separate and apart from these hybrid structures or new structures, just what they do with all those billions that are sitting on the side generating the money that they're. I have one client who said, he invests in master limited partnerships that do extraction in Canada. And he's a severe environmentalist. And he goes to them and he says, I'm going to take all these amazing dividends you give me, and then I'm going to give them to NRDC, and they're going to sue you. And I looked at him and I was like, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I think but that's a very old line view of you make the money here, you take that money, you put it over here, you spend that money over here, but don't bother me with what you're spending the money on over here, et cetera, et cetera.
Very inefficient. Very inefficient way to use our capital.
Those are all fair points. I think it's also worth pointing out, though, that foundations and other nonprofits make a lot of really stupid decisions for reasons totally unrelated to the corporate forms that they subscribe to.
Oh, yeah. All companies, all people and all corporations are in that category too.
There have been a couple of comments about the fatal inefficiency of nonprofits or the fatal character of nonprofits. And
not a couple of comments. I think there was one comment.
Blame it on me.
And then there are superb nonprofits and there are terrible.
Absolutely.
Nonprofits. And that may or may not be related to the corporate form.
Right.
That's very true.
No, I think
that
there's a critical role for both. And I mean, one example for me watching is the Gates Foundation, and it's really about, thinking about a more sort of systematic approach to social change. And, when they take on these massive goals, like let's eradicate polio, whatever it was, and there's, several of them amazing goals, and, spent years trying to do that and affect this change through grant making, and, came to realize that in order to have this kind of systems level effect, there are for-profit businesses that need to exist, that might not exist or need to grow, whether it's distribution systems, whether it's, drug delivery systems that have to exist to accomplish the purpose. And so now they have a PRI program, because all the money was put into the foundation, of, several $billion. And that didn't exist.
And let me just clarify, my frustration is not that they're not doing good, because and there are whole parts of the economy that the private sector can't. I mean, education programs for women coming out of prison. There is so much that has to be handled by non-capital market-driven solutions. Totally agree with that. My frustration is, and I think a lot of people, that they're having impact, they're doing an incredible amount of good, but we need to get them to, it's just like we need we're devoting all our time to changing the corporate form because we think the corporation is not doing enough the way it could, but it's not. The same thing with nonprofits. It's like, let's take Gates. If Gates had a different form, could it have more, could it have more impact? It's not that the impact that it has, so I'm clarifying.
There's also, from my prior experience, just a lack of people like the ones in the panel here. There are a lot of people in the kind of world of advising nonprofits that will tell you can't do a lot of things. And this was my experience at New Island, where aside from the main investment, a vehicle foundation was created, gigantic law firm somewhere not far from here, retained, and there was absolutely the word yes never appeared in a single memo from the law firm. You can't do, you can't do, you can't do. And I knew from Will and from Suze and now from Tomer, you can do. So part of the reason for panels like this is to encourage the legal profession,
Think more
even
creatively.
existing structures, to be a little bit more thoughtful and creative about what can be done.
I just want to say one last thing about measurement and outcomes. And I think figuring out, it's not just a new corporate form issue or a for-profit issue. It's across the board. When we talk about impact, I really believe all across that continuum we need to understand what we mean. And we need to have ways of measuring impact and factoring that into decisions that stakeholders make, donors, investors, others, that we're doing this more and more, and we didn't used to do this. Foundations, there are a lot of foundations that did this, but many didn't understand the impact of their grant-making program, of their PRI program. And so I think that conversation of figuring out how to measure impact, how to think about impact, is filtering throughout the sector on both sides, and I think that's a useful and healthy conversation.
Should I take back my fatally flawed comment?
If you feel that way, you should really look at both.
But I think that there are issues on both, and we need to improve both to be part of the solution. It's not that we need both, and both need to be more part of the solution.
Shall we call it?
Any other questions? Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.